So one of the best-selling books on wealth ever written, a manual that has been treated as a literal sacred text by millionaires and billionaires for almost a century, was actually written by a man who died broke. That is a staggering historical reality to confront right out of the gate, and it completely reframes how we have to look at the entire self-help industry. We are talking about Napoleon Hill today, specifically his 1937 masterpiece, Think and Grow Rich, the absolute bedrock of modern hustle culture. And I want to set the stage here because the context of 1937 is just crucial. This is right in the thick of the Great Depression. The American economy is entirely shattered. Unemployment is hovering around 15 to 20%. The Dust Bowl is ravaging the agricultural heartland. There is this pervasive, crushing sense of hopelessness everywhere you look. And into that absolute void drops this book, promising that literally anyone can manifest vast fortunes simply by mastering their own mind. It is a wild promise. And since that moment, it has sold over 100 million copies, translated into dozens of languages. You hear its core concepts quoted by Fortune 500 CEOs, by elite athletes visualizing their wins, and even in modern rap lyrics. I guarantee this book has been sitting on someone's nightstand every single decade for nearly a century. If you trace the genealogy of almost any modern philosophy of success or goal setting, the roots inevitably lead back to Napoleon Hill's typewriter. But then we run head first into this foundational irony. The man who wrote the ultimate manual on accumulating vast fortunes never actually became wealthy himself using his own methods. His wealth only arrived after people started buying his book about how to get wealthy, which means fundamentally he grew rich by teaching other people how to grow rich. It is the central paradox of Napoleon Hill, and we really have to wrestle with it before we even look at a single page of the text. Because when you analyze that specific timeline, there are basically two distinct ways to interpret his legacy. The generous perspective is that Hill was a brilliant synthesizer. He cracked the code of human motivation, packaged it brilliantly, and sold it to the masses. And in doing so, he became his own ultimate proof of concept. The book was just the vehicle for his principles to finally find their leverage. That is the generous view. But the second perspective is a lot more skeptical, and honestly, it is the one that immediately jumps out. If these 13 principles, the ones Hill actually capitalizes in the text, things like desire, faith, persistence, if these are veritable laws of the universe, why did they not work for him before he wrote the manuscript? If you hold the literal blueprint to limitless wealth, you should not be struggling to pay rent before the blueprint goes to the printer. You have to ask why the universal laws of success seemingly remained dormant until a publishing house got involved. Now, I do want to throw out a counter-argument to that skepticism, because is packaging an idea not a legitimate business in and of itself? Think of it like a fitness coach. The coach standing on the side of the track might not be an Olympic gold medalist. They might not even be able to run a 6-minute mile. But they understand the biomechanics, they understand the nutritional science, the psychological training regimen required to build an Olympian. They package the knowledge, and their athlete wins the gold. Hill could just be the coach. It is a highly pragmatic way to view it, and it highlights a tension that will follow us through this entire deep dive today. Because the story circulating around this book is just as important as the ink printed on its pages. To truly understand the packaging, we cannot just analyze the 13 principles in a vacuum. We have to look behind the curtain at the man who sold this philosophy to the world. We have to examine the raw materials he used to build it. And that is our exact mission today. We are sorting through a massive stack of research for this one. Excerpts from the original 1937 text, comprehensive historical and biographical data, modern reviews, and a highly critical analytical piece titled The Man, the Myth, and the Mindset. And I want to be clear about something. We are not here to do a sycophantic fanboy recap of the 13 principles. We are not treating them like unassailable magic. But we are equally avoiding the trap of a purely cynical takedown that dismisses 100 million readers as gullible fools. There is clearly something there. What we are doing is an honest 90-year retrospective. We are holding a mirror up to this legendary manual. We want to find out who Napoleon Hill actually was, where his ideas truly came from, and what specific cognitive mechanisms actually hold up to modern science. And critically, what dangerous toxic myths need to be surgically extracted and discarded. So to you listening right now, if you have ever felt completely overwhelmed by modern hustle culture advice that promises infinite wealth if you just adjust your vibration, stick with us. Because that advice traces its DNA directly back to this specific book. We are going to give you absolute clarity on what is actually worth your time and what is simply smoke and mirrors. The excavation has to start with the man himself, the official legend, the one Hill spent his entire adult life promoting, starts in 1908. Hill portrays himself as a young, scrappy, highly ambitious journalist who somehow manages to land an interview with Andrew Carnegie. And for historical context, Andrew Carnegie was a steel magnate who at that particular moment in time was quite literally one of the wealthiest human beings to ever walk the earth. Hill describes a sprawling, intimate 3-day and 3-night marathon discussion. During this epic sit-down, Carnegie supposedly leans across a table and issues this young kid a monumental challenge. He tells Hill to spend the next 20 years of his life interviewing the most successful men in America. We are talking about the absolute titans of industry: Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, John the 500th, Rockefeller, Alexander Graham Bell. Carnegie wants Hill to distill the secrets of these giants into a singular, digestible philosophy that the average working-class person can use to elevate themselves. And Carnegie explicitly states he will not pay a dime for this work, but he will open doors. And Hill, full of youthful bravado, says yes. It perfectly mirrors the hero's journey. It casts Hill not as a salesman, but as a chosen disciple. It provides the text with a profound aura of industrial-grade authority. The problem is that this meeting almost certainly never happened. David Nasaw's archival research on this is absolutely devastating to the legend. Nasaw is considered the definitive biographer of Andrew Carnegie, and when he was compiling his research, he naturally went looking for evidence of this legendary, life-altering encounter. He conducted an exhaustive excavation of Carnegie's archives, letters, diary entries, visitor logs, internal memos, any single passing mention from Carnegie's meticulous staff. He found absolute zero evidence that this meeting ever took place. Carnegie was notoriously insulated. His schedule was heavily guarded by a ruthless secretary. So the idea that an unknown journalist could secure 3 unscheduled days with a man whose time was literally dictating global steel markets is just historically absurd. There is no evidence they ever met, and absolutely no evidence that Think and Grow Rich was authorized or endorsed by Carnegie. But the detail that makes this fabrication so much worse is the timeline of when Hill actually started telling the story. He did not start making these grand public claims about his deep mentoring relationship with Carnegie until 1919, and that specific year is incredibly convenient. Andrew Carnegie died in August of 1919. He literally waited until the billionaire was dead, buried, and entirely unable to issue a public denial before claiming him as a personal mentor. He used a ghost as his primary alibi. When we place that fabrication alongside the broader picture of Hill's life prior to publishing the book, the skepticism compounds exponentially. Because if he was not spending 20 unbroken years purely studying the secrets of the ultra-rich under Carnegie's wing, what was he actually doing? The biographical data paints a very chaotic, legally dubious picture. Before he was the patron saint of positive thinking, Hill co-founded a lumber company, a venture that went bankrupt and was hit with serious allegations of mail fraud. He then launched a business in automobile education, claiming to teach people how to assemble cars. That failed. He started an advertising venture which resulted in the state of Illinois issuing 2 separate warrants for his arrest. The Federal Trade Commission later charged him with laundering money through a magazine he ran, and through a philanthropic organization he had founded, supposedly to help prison inmates. And then there is my personal favorite bizarre detail from the historical research. He became deeply involved with a strange mystical group in New York, essentially a cult, led by a man named Royal Lee, and this group was completely obsessed with creating what they called an immortal baby. I cannot emphasize enough to you listening, we are not making this up. They genuinely believed they could produce a child that would never die through bizarre spiritual and physical practices. The 1920s and 30s were a golden age for that kind of esoteric spiritualism, but it certainly does not align with the image of a rational business philosopher. And on a much darker note, his personal life carried severe allegations of domestic violence against his second wife and their toddler daughter. So the man dispensing the ultimate infallible wisdom on how to live a successful, harmonious life was simultaneously leaving a trail of bankruptcies and arrest warrants in his wake. It is a little like discovering that your absolute favorite spiritual guru, the one whose meditation techniques genuinely helped you find peace, was secretly running a massive financial scam on the side. Does a deeply flawed messenger automatically destroy the utility of the message? That question is the pivot point of our entire analysis today, and to answer it, we have to develop the capacity to hold two seemingly conflicting truths simultaneously. The first truth is that the messenger was deeply flawed, highly unreliable, and undeniably fabricated the core credentials of his authority. The second truth is that you cannot fake 100 million copies sold over 9 decades. You cannot artificially manufacture nearly a century of continuous, passionate relevance. People do not keep aggressively recommending a book to their children and business partners generation after generation if the material does absolutely nothing. There has to be a mechanism inside it that works. The ideas genuinely catalyze change for real people. Entrepreneurs, artists, leaders, they picked up this text during their darkest moments, applied the concepts, and experienced a tangible shift in their reality. The message successfully landed regardless of who threw it. So our job is to isolate the psychological mechanisms that actually worked and understand why they worked, which brings up the most glaring historical mystery. If Napoleon Hill did not actually get these secrets from a 20-year Carnegie-authorized study of the ultra-rich, where on earth did he find them? Here is the thing, Hill was not an inventor of a new philosophy. He was a master translator of an existing one. The ideas in Think and Grow Rich stem directly from a metaphysical movement that emerged in America in the 1870s, generally referred to as New Thought. If you have ever heard phrases like thoughts become things, or someone talking about putting a high vibration out to the universe, or the concept that what you focus on expands, that is entirely New Thought philosophy. It has just been rebranded for modern social media. The core radical premise of New Thought in the late 19th century was that the human mind possesses direct causal power over physical reality. Prior to this, the general consensus was that the mind merely reacted to the physical world. New Thought argued the inverse. Your mental state is the active driving cause of your external circumstances. The belief was that you could literally think your way into physical health, into harmonious relationships, and ultimately into staggering wealth. And this was not just fringe crystal-gazing mysticism confined to back rooms. This was a massive part of mainstream intellectual culture. William James, widely considered the father of American psychology, engaged very seriously with these ideas, specifically the concept of the mind cure movement. Ralph Waldo Emerson's transcendental writings on self-reliance fed directly into the philosophical groundwater that New Thought grew out of. To see exactly how heavily Hill drew from this movement, we only need to look at a man named Wallace Wattles. In 1910, which is 27 full years before Hill published his manuscript, Wattles wrote a brief but highly influential book. The title was The Science of Getting Rich. The title alone is a dead giveaway. 27 years before Hill claims to have finalized his Carnegie research, when you perform a deep textual comparison between Wattles and Hill, the overlap is undeniable. They utilize the exact same structural frameworks. They deploy the exact same vocabulary. Both men treat human desire not as an emotion but as a tangible metaphysical force. They both conceptualize the subconscious mind as a literal communication channel to a higher intelligence, what Wattles called formless substance. They both forcefully posit that organized thought is the absolute non-negotiable precursor to physical wealth. Wattles uses phrasing that Hill mirrors almost word for word, and Napoleon Hill never mentions Wattles once. He never credits the New Thought movement in any capacity. Instead, he consciously chose to launder these esoteric spiritual ideas through the fabricated authority of Andrew Carnegie, wrapping metaphysical concepts in the highly respected, unassailable suit of industrial capitalism. Think of Isaac Newton. Newton did not invent gravity. Gravity existed long before he sat under an apple tree. What Newton did was observe it, describe it, and translate it into mathematical laws. Hill did not invent the psychology of positive thinking. He codified it. He put it in a tailored suit specifically designed for the American businessman. Translation was his undeniable singular genius, because we have to look at the psychological landscape of 1937 again. The Great Depression had absolutely battered the American psyche. The institutions had failed. The banks had collapsed. People were broken. A working-class person standing in a bread line, feeling entirely powerless, was not going to pick up a metaphysical pamphlet by Wallace Wattles about spiritual vibration and formless substance. It would have felt insulting. But Hill took those exact same esoteric concepts and dressed them in the aggressive, pragmatic language of business strategy. He swapped out the mystical vocabulary for corporate terminology. Words like organized planning, the mastermind, specialized knowledge, and autosuggestion. He made mysticism legible and, more importantly, actionable for terrified Americans. He gave them a system that felt like taking back control. If we trace his concepts back to their true philosophical roots, it reads like an intellectual family tree of the 19th and early 20th centuries. When Hill talks about the vast hidden power of the subconscious, he is pulling directly from the early psychoanalytic work of Sigmund Freud and William James. When he talks about the universe operating on vibration and frequency, that is pure New Thought spirituality. When he talks about desire as this unstoppable force of nature, that maps perfectly onto Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will and Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. Hill just took all these heavy academic and spiritual ideas and turned them into a recipe. He pulled these complex ideas from the intellectual water he was swimming in, stripped away the academic density, and organized them into what felt like an industrial assembly line for the human mind. Now let's actually walk onto that assembly line. Now that we know the true origins, we need to examine the actual mechanics of the system he built. Hill lists 13 principles, but out of those 13, there are 4 that do the absolute heavy lifting. They are the engine of the entire philosophy. And the first one he introduces is desire. Hill opens his methodology by drawing a very rigid, aggressive line between a passive wish and an active state of being. He states that merely wishing for wealth is utterly useless. What generates results is what he terms a burning, relentless obsession. He argues that an obsession literally refuses to accept failure as a legitimate outcome, and he is not speaking metaphorically. He outlines 6 highly specific mechanical steps. You have to decide on an exact numerical amount of money. You have to establish a concrete date by which you will possess it. You must create a clear plan. And then, this is the part where it gets ritualistic. You have to write this statement down and read it out loud, projecting intense emotion, twice a day, every morning and every night. Now, standing in front of a mirror reciting a financial goal out loud sounds like bizarre magical thinking, but modern neuroscience actually provides robust support for the underlying mechanism. Psychologists today refer to this process as implementation intentions, and here is what is actually happening anatomically. If you just casually think, I want to start a business, your brain immediately floods you with a list of reasons why that is a terrible idea, why you are too tired, why the economy is bad. When a vague goal resides primarily in the prefrontal cortex, which handles logical reasoning, the prefrontal cortex is incredibly metabolically expensive to run. It gets fatigued easily. It is highly susceptible to distraction and doubt. But when you create a highly specific, emotionally charged goal, complete with numbers, dates, and repetitive visualization, you begin routing that information deeper into the brain. You move it toward the basal ganglia, which is the center for automatic, habit-driven behavior. By forcefully combining repetition with intense emotion, you are literally programming your brain's automatic pattern recognition systems to treat that goal as a core survival directive. The emotion is not just for dramatic effect. It is the actual code being written into the basal ganglia. Now, there is a serious issue with Hill's framing of this obsession worth addressing. Is treating a goal like a biological survival imperative actually healthy? Reading the source material, Hill openly praises industrial titans who essentially destroyed their personal relationships, ruined their physical health, and lived entirely unbalanced lives in pursuit of a singular financial metric. He treats this burning obsession as pure high-octane fuel, and he completely ignores the exhaust. It is a massive, highly destructive blind spot in his philosophy. He presents obsession as an unalloyed virtue. He holds up these ruthless industrialists as the ultimate pinnacle of human achievement, without ever pausing to calculate the collateral damage of their ambition. History is littered with individuals who achieved world-shifting innovations, but who were profoundly miserable and isolated, and left a wake of traumatized families and exploited workers behind them. Treating your life as a singular obsessive mission, without any self-awareness, is just stepping into a different kind of psychological prison. Which brings us to the second heavy-lifting principle, and it relies heavily on that obsession: faith. When Hill uses the word faith, he goes out of his way to clarify that he is not strictly talking about religious doctrine. He is introducing the concept of autosuggestion. He posits that the subconscious mind is entirely impervious to cold logic. It only responds to feeling and deeply held conviction. He essentially says you have to emotionally trick your own brain. You have to feed your subconscious these highly charged, repeated impressions until it accepts them as absolute physical truth. It is a remarkably prescient observation. What Hill is describing in 1937 is a crude but recognizable precursor to cognitive behavioral therapy, which would not be formalized for decades. CBT is grounded in the understanding that the internal narratives we constantly repeat eventually calcify into core beliefs. Those core beliefs then drive our automatic physiological and behavioral responses. Hill noted that the subconscious mind cannot easily distinguish between a vividly imagined, highly emotional event and an event that is actually occurring in physical reality. You see this validated everywhere in elite performance today. Olympic downhill skiers mentally rehearsing every single turn of the course before they run it. Surgeons visualizing a complex cardiac procedure. They are firing the exact same neural pathways as if they were physically performing the action. Neurologically, mental rehearsal is an incredibly powerful tool for skill acquisition and anxiety reduction. Hill was pointing at a very real, very potent cognitive mechanism. However, this is also the exact point where his philosophy veers into genuinely dangerous territory. He takes a valid psychological tool and expands it into a metaphysical guarantee. He begins to claim that if you believe with enough emotional intensity, the universe itself will literally reorganize physical matter to manifest your conviction. He steps right over the line from psychology into metaphysics, and the danger there is profound, because if you fundamentally believe that results are guaranteed purely by the intensity of your mental faith, what happens when you inevitably fail? What happens when a global pandemic shuts down your business, or you get an unforeseen cancer diagnosis, or the stock market crashes? His framework leaves you with only one brutal, inescapable conclusion. You did not believe hard enough. You failed at faith. Therefore, the failure, the sickness, or the bankruptcy is entirely your fault. It systematically removes all external factors from the equation and places a crushing, toxic psychological burden on the individual. It turns failure from a learning experience into a devastating character verdict. Now let's move to the third major principle, and honestly this might be the most fascinating part of the text, the mastermind. It is arguably the most underrated and profoundly accurate principle in the entire book. Every superficial summary mentions it, but almost none explore the deep sociological truth Hill was tapping into. Hill defines the mastermind as bringing two or more minds together in a spirit of absolute harmony to create an invisible third mind. In the context of 1937, that sounds incredibly mystical. It sounds like executives holding a seance in a boardroom to summon a ghost. But there is a direct connection here to a massive modern analytical study conducted by Google. In 2012, Google launched a massive internal research initiative called Project Aristotle. They spent years and millions of dollars analyzing hundreds of their own engineering and management teams. Their goal was to figure out why some teams were highly innovative and efficient, while other teams staffed with equally brilliant people completely stagnated. The initial assumption was that the best teams simply had the highest aggregate IQ, or the most experienced people. They tested everything: raw IQ, introverts versus extroverts, educational backgrounds, even whether team members shared hobbies outside of work. None of those factors correlated with high performance. The breakthrough came when they analyzed group dynamics and discovered the single most important determining factor: psychological safety combined with a shared meaningful purpose. When individuals felt safe enough to be vulnerable, to openly admit mistakes, to pitch wild ideas without fear of mockery, and when that group was fully aligned on a unified goal, they consistently produced outcomes that were exponentially greater than the sum of their individual intellect. They literally created Hill's invisible third mind. Google spent millions of dollars to empirically prove the Mastermind principle 75 years after Hill wrote it. It demonstrates that human cognition is not just an isolated supercomputer trapped in a skull, it is fundamentally a social network. We neurologically regulate each other, we challenge each other's blind spots, and we literally possess a higher cognitive capacity when we are connected in a harmonious group. Hill explicitly understood that your inner circle is not just social decoration, it is your actual intellectual infrastructure. If your network is chaotic, your cognitive output will be stunted. Now we have to tackle the fourth core principle, and this is the chapter that almost every corporate seminar skips, or the speaker awkwardly clears their throat and flips past it. Principle 4. Sex Transmutation. It makes modern readers deeply uncomfortable, which is often a strong indicator that a concept is touching on something very real, very primal, and deeply embedded in human nature. Hill makes the argument that sexual desire is the single most powerful physiological and motivational force in human biology. He observes that when a person is heavily driven by it, they naturally access levels of imagination, courage, and relentless persistence that simply do not exist in a neutral state. The raw energy is intensely powerful, but his radical proposition is about what happens if you consciously redirect that specific energy. He refers to this process as transmutation, and it is critical to note that he is not advocating for Victorian repression or strict celibacy. He is suggesting a conscious channeling of that intense physiological arousal away from purely physical expression and into creative, entrepreneurial, or professional output. It sounds bizarre on the surface, almost like alchemy, but think of it like plumbing. Imagine a wildly flailing high-pressure fire hose spraying water everywhere, creating chaos. What Hill is suggesting is taking that exact same high-pressure hose, controlling the nozzle, and plugging it directly into a turbine to generate electricity for a city. You are not stopping the flow of water, you are harnessing the immense pressure of it. And if we look across various intellectual and spiritual disciplines, Hill is in very prestigious company with this observation. Sigmund Freud built a massive portion of his psychoanalytic theory on the concept of sublimation. Freud argued that civilization itself, the creation of great art, the advancement of science, is largely fueled by humanity's necessary redirection of raw libidinal energy into productive channels. You see it in ancient Eastern traditions too. The yogic concept of brahmacharya focuses heavily on the conservation and intentional redirection of sexual energy to achieve spiritual enlightenment. You can even draw a line back to Nietzsche's will to power. The idea of a raw fundamental life force seeking expression in the world. What Hill was doing was taking a profound neurobiological reality, the fact that the state of deep creative flow shares a very similar neurochemical signature with intense physical desire, and framing it as a tool for the American entrepreneur. It is heavy in dopamine. When that potent biological energy has a highly structured, meaningful project to flow into, it becomes almost inexhaustible fuel. It is not 1930s mysticism, it is just neurobiology. So when we look at these four principles together, the implementation intentions of desire, the cognitive behavioral loops of faith, the psychological safety of the mastermind, and the neurochemical channeling of transmutation, they possess incredible, scientifically valid power. But, and this is the massive turning point in our analysis, Hill's overarching framework contains some incredibly dangerous blind spots. We have to address the collateral damage this philosophy has caused, because when you treat a self-help book like a sacred text, you become blind to its gaping structural flaws. There has been a pervasive spiral of silence surrounding Think and Grow Rich in the business community for decades. Because it is so universally revered, people are terrified to point out its logical and methodological failures. Let's break that silence. Point number 1. There is absolutely no empirical evidence for any of his specific sweeping claims. None. Hill writes with the tone of a physicist explaining gravity. He states that everything is an absolute immutable law of nature. Follow these exact steps and you will inevitably become rich. Yet he cites no scientific studies. He shows no underlying methodology for his research. And as we discussed with the Carnegie myth, his fabled archive of interviews supposedly burned in a mysterious fire. The dog ate my data. Incredibly convenient. Compare Hill's dogmatic approach to a modern financial thinker like Ray Dalio. Dalio is incredibly successful, but he writes extensively about building systems specifically designed to prove his own theories wrong. Dalio stresses the importance of radical transparency and actively hunting for your own blind spots. Dalio treats uncertainty and the probability of being wrong as the baseline reality. Hill, on the other hand, treats absolute certainty as the actual product he is selling. And when certainty is the product you are selling, any form of doubt or critical questioning is viewed as a failure of faith. That is an incredibly dangerous way to navigate a highly complex, unpredictable world. It forces the mind to close itself off to new, potentially life-saving information. It breeds arrogance, which leads directly to point number 2. And the book is absolutely soaked in this. Survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is a fundamental logical error. It occurs when you concentrate entirely on the people or things that successfully made it past some complex selection process, while completely ignoring those that did not, because the failures lack visibility. The classic example is the military analyzing returning bombers in World War II. They wanted to put armor where the bullet holes were on the returning planes, completely ignoring that the planes shot in the engine never returned at all. Hill builds his entire philosophy by exclusively analyzing the planes that returned. He looks backward at the absolute undeniable winners, Edison, Ford, Carnegie. He reverse engineers their success based entirely on the traits they share. He looks at Edison and says, Edison had a burning desire, an immense persistence. Therefore, desire plus persistence guarantees billions. What he structurally cannot do, or willfully refuses to do, is ask the inverse critical question. How many thousands of unrecorded inventors out there had the exact same burning desire, read their goals out loud twice a day, and still died completely bankrupt? We do not know the answer to that because Hill did not interview the thousands of failures. He did not count the invisible graveyard of people who followed his exact steps and lost everything. If you build a philosophy entirely by studying the victors, you are not doing science. You are not discovering universal laws. You are simply doing storytelling. As the saying goes, the plural of anecdote is not the actor. Which brings us to the third flaw, and it is arguably the most ethically damaging. The book is completely willfully blind to structural reality. We have to heavily contextualize the author and the era. Napoleon Hill was a white man writing in 1937 America. He constructs a philosophical framework claiming that success, wealth, and power are 100% internally generated. He argues it is purely and exclusively a matter of your individual mindset, the heat of your desire, and the strength of your faith, which completely and utterly ignores the reality of the external physical world. He ignores the massive advantage of inherited generational wealth. He ignores systemic racism. He ignores sexism. He ignores the undeniable historical fact that in 1937, massive sweeping portions of the American population were legally, socially, or financially barred from even entering the industries he is talking about conquering, and he completely ignores the profound impact of pure luck, being born in the right zip code, to the right parents in an expanding economy. This creates a profoundly important ethical issue with the text that modern readers must be aware of. If you take this philosophy, which claims success is entirely internal, and you hand it to someone trapped in genuine structural poverty or facing systemic oppression, and you tell them the only reason they are not wealthy is because their mindset is flawed or their desire is not burning hot enough, you are setting them up for a deeply toxic cycle of self-blame. If success is 100% internal, then your failure is 100% your fault, and that is an empirically demonstrably false view of how the world actually operates. It functions as a philosophy that aggressively flatters the winners by telling them their wealth is entirely a product of their own virtuous mindset, while simultaneously punishing the marginalized by telling them their lack of wealth is a personal moral failing. The historical myths busted, the magical thinking called out, and the structural socioeconomic blindness exposed. What is actually left in the rubble of this book? Is it just a historical artifact we should throw away? Because as we established, the ideas do work for people. There are undeniably brilliant, scientifically backed, pragmatic tools hidden in this text that you can extract and realistically use tomorrow morning. Let's start salvaging them. The first incredibly useful, highly actionable tool hidden in the text is his sharp observation on decision-making. Hill writes that wealthy, highly successful people make decisions very quickly and they change their minds very slowly. Conversely, he observed that unsuccessful people decide incredibly slowly if they decide at all, and they change their minds rapidly based on the shifting opinions of everyone around them. Now, why is chronic indecision so neurologically detrimental? Modern cognitive psychology explains the friction of indecision through something called the Zeigarnik effect. This is a psychological principle discovered in the 1920s by a psychologist named Bluma Zeigarnik. She observed waiters in a busy cafe and realized they perfectly remembered complex unpaid orders, but the second the bill was paid, they completely forgot what the people had eaten. The principle dictates that the human brain remembers uncompleted or interrupted tasks much better than completed tasks. When you leave a major decision unmade, it does not just sit there passively in the background, it stays actively running in your working memory. It acts exactly like leaving 20 tabs open on your internet browser. It constantly drains your cognitive bandwidth, slows down your processing speed, and generates a low-grade, persistent hum of anxiety. So forcing a decision, even if it is not the absolute perfect one, closes that psychological loop. It frees up the RAM in your brain. Deciding closes the loop. It allows you to immediately reallocate that precious cognitive bandwidth toward execution and problem solving, rather than being paralyzed by rumination. Hill intuitively understood that forward momentum requires closed loops. The second salvageable tool is understanding how to actually use the subconscious as a co-pilot, rather than treating it like a magic genie in a lamp. Hill's language constantly drifts into New Thought mysticism, heavily suggesting the subconscious magnetically attracts physical wealth from the ether. But if we strip away the metaphysical poetry, what he is actually describing is a biological, neurological filtering system. Think of it as the red car syndrome. You finally decide to buy a red car, and suddenly you see red cars on every single street corner, in every parking lot, on every highway. The universe did not magically manufacture thousands of new red cars overnight to please you. Your brain just altered its internal filtering mechanism because you explicitly told it that red cars are now highly relevant to your life. The scientific term for this biological filter is the reticular activating system. It is a bundle of nerves at our brainstem. Our brains are constantly bombarded by an unimaginable amount of data, roughly 11 million bits of sensory information every single second. But the conscious waking mind can only actively process about 40 to 50 bits of information per second. If we processed everything, we would go insane. The reticular activating system acts as the ultimate bouncer at the door of your consciousness. It filters out the millions of bits of irrelevant noise and only lets in the specific information that matches your internal programming, your core beliefs, and your focused state of desire. So when Hill tells you to write your specific goals down and read them out loud twice a day with intense emotion, he is not teaching you a magic spell to summon gold coins from the sky. He is teaching you how to manually, deliberately program your own reticular activating system. You are training your brain's biological filter to scan the environment and spot the opportunities, the connections, and the subtle openings that were actually always there, but that you previously ignored completely because your filter was not looking for them. That is a highly practical, scientifically validated cognitive tool. You are changing what your brain perceives as signal versus noise. And that leads directly to the third major salvageable takeaway: treating persistence as an engineered system rather than a moral virtue. Most of us treat persistence like it is a fixed genetic personality trait, like having blue eyes or being left-handed. You either naturally possess grit, or you were simply born without it. But Hill argues, and modern behavioral science heavily backs him up, that persistence is not a trait you simply have. It is an environment you actively build around yourself. If we look at the extensive modern research by psychologist Angela Duckworth on the concept of grit, her data brings her to the exact same conclusion. Raw willpower is a finite, highly depletable resource. Motivation is simply an emotion. And like all human emotions, happiness, anger, sadness, it fluctuates severely and eventually, inevitably, dies out. Motivation will absolutely abandon you. It always leaves you on a random Tuesday morning when it is raining outside, you are exhausted, and you have to do the hardest part of the project. Therefore, the people who actually succeed over a 10 or 20-year timeline do not rely on internal motivation, they rely on environmental design. Hill's entire rigorous prescription, the writing down of specific goals, the creation of rigid step-by-step plans, and crucially, the building of a mastermind group who will hold you accountable, is all about creating an external system. You are building an infrastructure that physically and socially pulls you forward when your internal motivation inevitably collapses. You are outsourcing your willpower to a system you built when you were feeling strong. That is an incredibly pragmatic way to approach long-term goals. Which brings us to the ultimate overarching lesson of this entire deep dive. This is the meta lesson that is not explicitly written anywhere in Hill's famous 13 steps, but it is the most important thing you can take away from his legacy. The profound lesson here is that highly useful, world-changing ideas come from deeply unreliable sources all the time. Human intellectual history is entirely built on this exact contradiction. Consider Sigmund Freud. By the standards of modern evidence-based psychiatry, Freud was wrong about a tremendous amount of human psychology. His specific methodologies were deeply flawed, and many of his conclusions were bizarre, but he fundamentally, undeniably discovered the concept of the unconscious mind, the revolutionary idea that human behavior is largely driven by massive hidden forces beneath our conscious awareness. That singular insight changed humanity, literature, and medicine forever. We do not discard the reality of the unconscious mind just because Freud, the man, was deeply flawed. Look at Charles Darwin too. He absolutely nailed the overarching theory of natural selection. It is the bedrock of all modern biology. But when he wrote it, he had absolutely no mechanism to explain how traits were actually passed down from generation to generation. He did not know genetics. He did not know DNA existed. He was fundamentally world-shatteringly correct about the big picture, even while he was completely missing massive critical pieces of the puzzle. And that is exactly how we must view Napoleon Hill. He undeniably fabricated his credentials. He borrowed heavily from New Thought philosophy without giving an ounce of credit to his predecessors. He lived a chaotic, financially unstable, often unethical personal life. And yet, amidst all of that smoke and mirrors, he successfully packaged profound psychological truths. Truths about the power of focus, the malleability of the subconscious, the reality of social cognition, and the necessity of engineered persistence. And he delivered those truths in a fiercely pragmatic way that genuinely helped heal and motivate a broken nation during the darkest days of the Great Depression. Both of those realities are true at the exact same time. So to you, the listener, how should you consume self-help moving forward? How should you approach the next business deep dive or the latest bestseller on productivity? The ultimate lesson here is that there is no secret blueprint. There is no flawless, omniscient guru who is going to descend from the mountain and hand you a magical, guaranteed formula for your life. You have to take on the hard, messy work of being a ruthless, critical thinker. You have to hold every single idea up to the harsh light of reality. Take what is scientifically sound, take what is practically useful for your specific, unique life circumstances, and leave the magical thinking, the survivorship bias, and the systemic blindness on the floor. Knowledge is only truly valuable when it is understood critically and applied practically. Do not ever worship the messenger. Rigorously interrogate the message. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. It comes from one of the strangest, most vivid, almost fairy tale-like anecdotes in the original 1937 source material. Hill tells the story of what he calls the enchanted kettle. It is the slightly mythologized origin story of Coca-Cola. In the late 1800s, an old, tired country doctor had a heavy brass kettle, a wooden paddle, and a secret chemical formula written on a small slip of paper. He sold that entire outfit to a young, highly ambitious drug clerk named Arthur Candler for exactly $500. Now, the doctor's formula alone, sitting on a piece of paper, did not do much of anything. But Candler, the young clerk, took that formula and added one specific ingredient that the old doctor knew absolutely nothing about. And that singular ingredient, which Hill defines as a definite burning purpose backed by massive relentless action, turned that bubbling brass kettle into a global empire worth billions of dollars. So here is my final challenge for you. Look around at your own life right now. What is the magic kettle sitting quietly in your background? What dormant skill? What piece of specialized knowledge? What simple half-finished idea do you already possess that is just waiting for you to stop wishing? And finally add the active ingredient of a burning obsessive decision.